Hi, Mark. Thanks for coming.
Hey Jack, how's it going? Thanks for the
I'm
invitation.
good. Well, to get right into this, you're an expert on in cognitive science and a theory called predictive processing that studies cognition. But I also want to first ask, to understand cognition and predictive processing in your account of cognition, what do we have to know about cognitive science and humans before we understand predictive processing?
Okay, cool. Yeah, what do we have to know before we think about predictive processing? I'm not sure. In a way, this framework is sort of a first principles approach.
Uh-huh.
So in a way, people are pitching this framework as a way of thinking about, if you go to the deep end, we're thinking about just what it is to be a thing, is to think about thingness in terms of reducing the surprise, which is just to
Yeah.
say to maintain yourself as whatever the thing you are over time. So I think rather than thinking about what do you need to know about
Yeah.
humans before the framework, you might think about what does the framework tell us about what it is to be a human. And
Uh-huh.
the people that are listening to this, have you already done a few episodes on predictive processing, or is this the first one
Nothing
where
on
you're thinking?
predictive processing. So now that you say that, then let's understand cognition by understanding predictive processing.
Right.
So what
Yeah,
is
nice.
predictive processing?
Yeah, okay. So here's one way that I like sort of introducing the idea. You can think about what it's not. So
Hmm.
it might be surprising, but we have some of the same ideas that we generated about the brain and about the cognitive system from 100 years ago, still very much alive and in play today, even though technology has advanced considerably over 100 years. And consider technology is advancing considerably every 5 years, and probably every year now. In fact,
Hmm.
it wasn't too long ago that we got the fMRI, and but we've had some ideas around for a long time about how the brain processes information. And humans are slow to update their models of how things work. And that's probably a good thing, because if you update too quick, then you are probably going to be picking hypotheses that aren't useful. Like if you have too gooey a model of how it works. But there are some things that need updating. Like, for instance, for a long time, we thought that the way the perception works is that light comes from the world and it hits, let's say, vision. Okay. Light comes from the world and hits the sensory apparatus with the eyes. And then the brain processes that raw visual information from simple, starting at the eye, and then rolling down and up the cortex,
Hmm.
and being the visual process is being rendered and processed increasingly in more increasingly complex ways as it rolls up and over, some really from
Hmm.
bottom to top.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have known that there was lots of lateral and a little bit of top down as well. So we don't want to make too much of a cartoon here, but we really did have the idea that information came from out of the world, and then the brain processed it from bottom to top. And what that gives you is a picture of the brain as really passive. We have a sort
Hmm.
of, I like what Andy Clark says, a couch potato view of the brain, where the brain just sits around and waits. And as information comes in, it processes it. And this framework, predictive processing or active inference, um, does something really provocative and really quite revolutionary. So it's cool to be. I mean, it's really cool to be in cognitive science today, because this is
Hmm.
happening. This is happening in real time. Some of these ideas are really like coming on board, and this is a really popular framework today. You
Hmm.
literally take the old idea and flip it right on its head and say, no, 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 hold on. The brain, rather than waiting around for information and then processing that information, instead is radically proactive. What the brain is actually built to do is to learn about all the statistical regularities it can about how the body works and how the environment works and how the body and environment interact over a long period of time. That's called the generative model. And then it uses that model to anticipate what happens next. And your experience and your actions are always a manifestation of this expectation for what happens next. The sort of, here's the provocative catch point. That means that the sensory signal that's coming in isn't what you're seeing. It's not what
Hmm.
you're experiencing. You're experiencing your own top down prediction on what happens next. And the sensory information that's coming into the body is just being used to train your predictions, to improve your predictions. Um, there's been some like there's been a little bit of debate about this idea about a controlled hallucination. It's
Hmm.
a term that Anil Seth popularized. I think it actually comes from before Anil. Um, uh, and maybe it is a bit punchy or a bit, I mean, it's pretty sexy to say that perception is
Hmm.
controlled hallucination. And it might not be 100% accurate, but I think it's kind of sexy to say it. But you
Hmm.
get what they mean there, which is your perception is actually your own expectation And the information from the world is just a training signal. Now, that should make you feel a little bit funny inside, because that means you're not really seeing light from the world. Light from the world is just training your top-down expectation. What you're really seeing is your top-down expectation. So that's it in a gulp. At least the cool part, I think.
Yeah. And a follow-up question on that. So me and my friend, I was discussing that I was going to be talking to you, and he was like, isn't it? And he was talking to me how it's strange, that if light is hitting our eyes, it's like, and we see perception in this old cognitive science framework, like we just see from the bottom up, we perceive, and then that is what we see.
Yeah.
But in this framework, it's kind of actually, would you say it's wrong to say that we're actually kind of instantly intuiting the light hitting our eye, and that's what we see? It's not that's in a sense, could you say that it's not that our cognition is late? It's like, where should we have them? We're seeing the world in real time. It's just we're always using a model. So
yeah, in a way, this approach solves some of, I mean, it's a great way for a perceptual system to evolve if it has to be making real-time decisions in the moment. Because think, rather than waiting around for a signal to be processed before you know what's happening, because imagine like in the good old-fashioned cognitive science, the way that would work is perception comes in, then so remember there's a sandwich, right? The perception comes in, the cognitive system then interprets what that information means, and then comes up with a plan, and then implements that plan by activating a bunch of behaviors. Okay, that's how it was. So cognition did all of the heavy lifting, and it was sandwiched between perception and action. And actually, if you build a system like that, if you build a robot like that, you end up having a really slow processing speed, because lots of stuff has to happen in the middle before you end up acting. And in a world that's so volatile like ours, that's probably no bueno for living systems that want to stay alive. They don't have time to go, oh, like, is that a tiger? Yeah, that's a tiger. What should we do about the tiger? And then run. So this instead looks like what it is to see the tiger in the first place is that you already have a predictive model in play, guessing that that's what's about to happen. And part of that guess, I mean, this is where this framework and embodied cognitive science come so beautifully together. What that guess actually is in part an embodied preparation to respond to that expectation. So if you haven't read it, or if people at home are listening to this and they want to like look into this a little more deeply, Barrett and Barr's paper, Seeing with Feeling, is such a wonderful paper to read if you're looking for some of the embodied dynamics here. So what they show is that, for instance, in order to see an apple, the system is getting rough data from the world. It's making a first approximation that maybe it's an apple. That first approximation turns on apple grabbing anticipatory dynamics, apple eating anticipatory dynamics. The digestive system starts producing enzymes that are apple related. That all together refines the expectation that it's an apple, which hones in your sort of perceptual system to grab hold of appleness. Now you're grabbing memories as well, and expectations about what to do with the apple. Now that's all before you even see the apple. The apple then emerges with all of this anticipatory dynamic stuff online. That's what it is to see the apple in the first place. I mean, what an efficient way to build a system, because by the time you see the apple, you're prepped to grab the apple and eat the apple and use the apple. You know everything about the apple. So that's maybe how we're seeing the world as well. We're not waiting for these signals to come in and then refining them. Rather, our expectation is really rich. It comes with all sorts of behavioral stuff.
Awesome. And I'm trying to think about how we go forward to further give some color to what predictive processing tells us about ourselves. So you tell me if this is a bad place to jump into it. I'm wondering given that we're trying to predict the world and we're trying to reduce errors between it, what would well-being be and what would addiction be? How could the system benefit us, and how could it sort of make a situation be poorly adapted to it?
Yeah, it's good. So right. So we've been looking at let's start here. Predictive processing and active inference is turning out to be a really potentially powerful and at least a really interesting framework for thinking about computational psychiatry. So looking at, can we make sense of pathology using the sort of anticipatory dynamical story? And when you do that, when you look at various sorts of pathologies through that lens, we're learning a lot. We're learning a lot about, well, I think what we're generating is really interesting new models of how those pathologies might work, which is helping to uncover different things that we maybe didn't know about the nature of those pathologies, and also how we might invent new and beneficial clinical interventions for those pathologies as well. So we've been thinking about that for a little while. So we've rendered a couple of pathologies through this framework, like addiction and depression and OCD, depersonalization, derealization. So it's a nice topic. First, you might think, okay, let me just make it clear if anybody at home doesn't know the framework. If this framework is right, then what it is to be a predictive system like us is to be in some way optimal. Okay, we are an optimizing system, which means we're making predictions about what happens next, and the disparity between what we expect and what really happens, we're using the difference between that to optimize the system so that it produces a better predictive grip in the next moment. And there's a whole suite of mathematical tools to express this optimality. So in a way, we are really what it is to be a living system, if this is right, or at least a living cognitive system like us, and maybe all systems. Some people think everything that's alive is this kind of anticipatory system. Let's say we don't have to go that far. We can just say, cognitive human system is an optimizing system. It's always trying to optimally update its own grip on the world by harvesting the right sorts of information in order to make a good fit with the environment, which is just the best place to be if you want to stay alive. So you might think like, okay, well, if what we are first and foremost is an optimizing system, then why do we run suboptimal so often? Because it doesn't look like we're optimizing systems. It looks like we live garbage lives often. And that doesn't look very optimal. So like you look at addiction, or you look at depression, you look at anxiety, you look at PTSD. I'm really interested in PTSD. Those look like suboptimal outcomes. How is it that how is it that an optimal system or an optimizing system produces suboptimal outcomes? And the answer is that just because a system is optimally updating, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a good system, because actually you can optimally update in all sorts of ways that don't lead to optimal outcomes. And the most important factor there is the shape of the generative model. So based on what beliefs you have installed, you are always making predictions relative to those beliefs. And there are ways that you can get nasty belief networks installed that then can bias the system in all sorts of suboptimal ways. For instance, addiction is a really good example of that, a really clear example. So for instance, opioids, they act on the system in a way, like we could think that when you take an opioid, it informs the predictive system that whatever action suite just took place, which is the drug seeking and taking behavior, whatever that action system was that just got used, that was like a way better than expected way to improve your predictive grip. So the drug actually informs the system. It says, whatever you just did, whatever your expectations were that led to this outcome, we want to turn the volume up on those predictions in a big way. That's called precision weighting. We want to turn the volume up on those predictions in particular, because they led to this unbelievably good predictive outcome. It's like you've just resolved a ton of volatility. So let's say, like, if just to make a note there, like if you're hungry, you expect to be well fed. So if you're hungry, the pain of hunger is like error in the system. It's volatility in the system. You expect to be well watered. If you're thirsty, the pain you're feeling is a rise in volatility. You expect to be loved. When you're lonely, the pain that you're feeling is the difference between your expectation to be social and where you actually are. And those aren't agentive expectations. Those are deep running, deep model expectations. Like you evolutionarily have those expectations in play.
So with opiates, then, like, is there something? Could you say something like there's there is a natural amount of error in the system. Like, are you reducing error when if you take opiates like as like or drugs of addiction? Is that
Good.
right? Is
Right.
that what you think of it?
Right. Exactly. No and
No.
yes.
Okay.
No, you're not actual. How do you say it?
I see what you mean. Okay, go
No,
on.
hold
Yeah.
on. So there's a big comorbidity between being hungry, thirsty, lonely, abused, and having no real meaningful way of increasing your predictive grip, and the
Hmm.
use of narcotics. Okay, we know that when people have a
Hmm.
lot of suffering, then there tends to be a vulnerability to especially drugs like opioids. Okay, the reason might be, at least looking at it through this framework, the reason
Hmm.
is that you have all of this latent volatility in your life that you are having a really hard time managing. You can't self-organize in the way that's letting you reduce the volatility relative to your expectations. Okay, so you've got this latent background suffering. You have this latent background mismatch between the way you want the world to be, well fed, well watered, well loved, and in a place where I actually have a meaningful life that matters to me and opportunities to improve. You don't have any of that. Okay, so you've got this latent background volatility. And what the opioid does is it signals to the system a sudden dump of volatility. It tells the system, you just did it. You did it. Like all the things you care about, all of that
Hmm.
error between the person you want to be and the person that you actually are. And there's a tremendous amount of distance there. That's why you're suffering. It collapses that in a moment. I mean, if that's the case, then it's not surprising that people are heroin addicts. It's surprising that we're not all heroin addicts in a way, because that's what it does. It informs the system that you've suddenly had a massive coming together of who you expect to be and who you actually are. Now, does it actually do that relative to the world that you're living in? Like, have you improved your relationship with the niche? No, it's
Hmm.
like empty calories. It informs the system that you've found a better way to self-organize, except for you haven't found a better way to self-organize. And the wonderful thing here, just following Mark Lewis, is actually relative to this story, the brain hasn't done anything wrong here. It's not like the brain is diseased in addiction
Hmm.
per se. The brain is still optimizing. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. It's optimizing relative to its information that it's getting in. The issue is that we didn't evolve to have signals like opioids come into the system, because those signals adjust our belief networks. It changes the belief network to believe that drug seeking and taking is a bona fide way to reduce volatility, and like a seriously good way, like a really like an unbelievable way of managing
Hmm.
volatility. But it turns out to be the opposite, of course. You think that that's going to make it better,
Right.
but actually it makes it worse over the long term.
This is a helpful clarification. So it's not a reduction error, or if it is, it's like a false error, and it's more like a no. Look, reattune yourself to you said your the sort of the prediction weighting. Just look at other things, because you clearly ignored something which is just way better than what you've done. But the question I have then is, we aren't all opiate addicts. So
No.
then what allows us in this framework to be people that can sort of fulfill goals in a more meaningful sense?
Yeah, good. So yeah, unsurprisingly, I mean, in a way, the computational framework is giving us a new suite of tools to make sense of and uncover some of the subtle relationships here. But I mean, this is really not a new story. Um, but just like I'd said a moment ago, one of the things that makes us vulnerable to, for instance, opioids is a sort of meaning crisis, like John Vervaeke would say, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're a predictive system. You are built to get a good self-organization, predictive grip of your ever-changing environment, and that includes um, all sorts of expectations that you're trying to fulfill. And some of these are really evolutionarily ancient expectations, like to be loved, to be cared for, to be able to progress in skills and abilities, to be fed, to be safe, to be healthy. Okay, and the degree to which those things are being thwarted is also the degree to which the system may become vulnerable to finding hacks that give it momentary reprieve from suffering, even if it means a loss of good predictive grip over the long term. So now just work backwards. So what protects us from that would be to be the kind of agent that has a good predictive grip on the scene. If you have already low volatility, you're able to self-organize in ways that make sense to you. You're in a situation where your predictions about who you are being met well by the world. And in fact, the world is offering better than expected opportunities, which we love. I mean, we can get into that too, but when we do better than expected, the system feels super good. That's one of the things that's what we think the reward system is tracking, is better than expected slopes of error reduction. So when you're in that, then there actually is no need. There's less of a need to look for potential hacks to reducing this error. So I mean, there's some really nice experiments. They're a little bit debated, but I think the story works. There were some early experiments. You ever heard of the rat park experiments? Do you know this?
Yeah.
I love this story, like you put a rat in a small cage with no games and no opportunity to improve. Okay. So what this framework then highlights is that rat is experiencing tons of volatility. It's tons of things it doesn't expect to be. It's alone. It has no opportunity to puzzle things out. Rats are super intelligent. They want to be working things out. They have no opportunity to be improving their predictive models. They're just stuck in a crappy little cage. And then you give them water and you give them opioids. And what do they drink? They go to the opioids because the opioids give them a sense that I'm living a fulfilled rat life. It's not. It's actually slowly poisoning the rat. Now, you leave the rat in that cage, becoming an opioid addict for a number of months, and then you move it into a rat park. This is a 3x3 meter, super fun place to live with a ton of friends and all sorts of mazes and stuff to do and stuff to work with. And then you give them the same 2 bottles are there. And I think our folk psychology for the last so many decades would say, well, for sure, they just keep doing the opioid because they're hooked. They're addicts. That actually, lo and behold, they almost immediately stop going to the opioid and just go back to the water. They get better on their own, and that's a really provocative and I think a really interesting finding that I think we should take seriously. That it might not be a war on drugs that we should be activating. It shouldn't maybe be getting rid of the opioid bottle, but rather moving the lonely rat back into a meaningful niche. And the meaningful niche will be the thing that resolves the addiction. And we might not have an opioid crisis. We might have a meaning crisis. An opioid crisis is a byproduct of not having a meaningful enough niche to work out. That's going to be a complex issue, but I think it's an important and provocative piece of the story that we should be taking seriously.
Yeah. Well, one place that it compels me to go from here is you talk about the rat park and how one thing that it seems in this beautiful park that it's now given that means it doesn't need to drink that opioid water is that it can play, right? And I'm wondering, you write a paper on play, the kind of need for it and what it is in this framework, and I'm wondering what is play in this framework and what can it kind of do to help us better come to grips with sort of the world?
Oh, it's good. It's good. It's a good question, Jack. And it's really the thing I like talking about most. Okay. It might be a little technical, but let's work it. Sure. You flag me if it's a bit heavy.
Sure. Let me ask follow-up questions. Sure.
And then we'll back up.
I'll stop you. Yeah.
So I'm really interested today in curiosity and playfulness, and especially a little bit scary playfulness or dangerous playfulness. Yeah. Like rough and tumble playfulness, I think is a really interesting thing. So we have a new paper just about to drop with Coltan Scrivener, who's the big horror researcher, and Ben White, who's a graduate student with Andy Clark at the University of Sussex. And our paper is called Surfing Uncertainty with Screams. And it's about the way that horror media, horror movies can really actually be beneficial for predictive systems. So I'm really interested in this discussion. Okay, let me start it by saying it's weird that we like to, well, it might sound weird. It actually turns out to be totally ordinary, but it might sound weird that for a system that's built to reduce prediction error, to reduce volatility, and to increase their predictive grip on a scene, it might sound weird that actually we love to get the crap scared out of us at theaters. We love to jump out of airplanes and free climb El Capitan We love playing in ways that are a bit dangerous and a bit volatile. I mean, kids will blindfold themselves to play games or lift a foot to play games. Those are increasing volatility mechanisms. So why is it that a volatility minimizing system turns out to be super attracted to and really enjoy volatility increasing activities? And actually early on in the framework, that was used as a kind of pushback argument to some of these ideas. It's the dark room worry is what it was called. It was, if we are prediction error minimizing systems, why don't we end up in a dark room being fed intravenously where there is no volatility to manage? Why don't we feel like, oh man, that sounds so good. I just love to get in my pod and sleep for a year or two. That's like the best place to be. And I mean, if you're overworked or you're depressed, that actually does sound like a super nice thing, I think. But it's not nice for very long. So why is that the case? How do we solve that puzzle? Because solving that puzzle is what helps us understand why play and risky play and scary play end up being interesting for us. So the puzzle gets solved when you appreciate that we are not trying to just get a good predictive grip now, but rather we have a deep, as they say, a deep temporal model. So that means we are paying attention to how we're minimizing error over a lifetime and in a really complex environment like the one that we're growing up in. And it turns out that if you just minimize error locally and try to stay there, like a dark room situation, even though you're going to minimize volatility here, because the environment is so volatile, the likelihood that you're going to be able to stay in that state for a long time is almost nil in our kind of world. And so even though you're successfully managing error locally, you are setting yourself up to be brittle as an error minimizing system globally. Okay, because what happens in a dark room? You develop no skills, you develop no abilities, you don't really learn how to be resilient against different kinds of errors. You don't learn the best way to self-organize relative to different kinds of slopes of volatility. If you want to get a good predictive grip over an entire lifetime in our kind of complex situation, then it's good for you to be sensitive to the right kinds of errors rather than getting no error. Find the right kinds of errors and start digesting them, which allows you to become more resilient as an error minimizing system, which sets you up for long-term success.
So how can we get that resiliency? Like if you're in a dark room and you're reducing errors in that short term, how can one sense that, okay, this is working right now to reduce errors, but I know that actually it's limiting other opportunities?
Good. So for most people, that's not like an add-on. That's just the way the system functions. So the system is always making long-term expectations. So for instance, if you play, like we have a game, we have a great paper out on video games as well. We'll give you the link. So there we were thinking, and this makes sense with addiction too. Let's say you're playing a video game, okay, and you're putting a few hours into it. You might be successfully reducing error in the game, but you have multiple predictive systems at play at any one time. So it's not like you completely forget the slopes of volatility relative to your relationship, relative to your personal hygiene, relative to your career. So, and we have the phenomenology of that too, right? You're playing the new Zelda game, you're kicking ass, it feels awesome, and yet you have an increasingly background sense of pressure that I'm actually supposed to be writing a paper today, and that's not going to stay on the back burner forever. And that's the volatility coming in the background, tracking that you are now doing worse than expected at reducing the error relative to your paper writing, which is hooked into all of this career stuff. If you don't write that paper, you don't keep the job. If you don't keep the job, you don't keep the house. If you don't keep the house, you probably lose your partner. You lose your partner, you're all alone. Now you're on the street and nobody loves you. And that is actually a little bit hooked up. Okay. Yeah. So that matters. And you have multiple predictive cares and concerns running in parallel all the time. So for most systems that are well organized and are well adapted, those different flows of expectation, they're going to be playing a role in what the system is attracted to. So for a healthy, well-organized system, you're playing video games until the background error basically hits a certain crescendo at which you task switch away from the game and back to your work. And then that work comes down. But of course, as you work there and that comes down, your sense of needing to like, hang out with your game or like to take care of your partner or to like walk your dog, they also start rising in volatility. And so then life turns out to be this like this parallel predictive regime where you're reducing error, like spinning plates. You're keeping the plate spinning by reducing the volatility as you see them come out of sync. That's how it should work.
Right.
With addiction, though, local error resolution can be crafted, or with drugs, it comes wholesale because the drug itself pumps the system in this way. But behavioral addictions, like video game addiction to pornography, gambling, okay, what's happening there is you're having local error minimizing dynamics are being generated that are so attractive. They're so powerful. They can create the sense that you're resolving so much meaningful error that they drown out some of the rising errors in the background. And that's one of the ways that we think the system can run suboptimally, is that you can get overly powerful local minimization of error at the expense of more global minimization of error. You start losing track of the longer term cares and concerns for overly punchy, fatty, sugary local error reduction.
Right. And if we thank you. And if we bring this back to play, like, could we say that, so with addiction, you're, say, reducing local error, but at the expense of global error? I wonder why then someone increases like local, say, volatility in play. I wonder, is one way to think about play then like almost the opposite of addiction? We like create our own volatility.
Good. Perfect.
Okay.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. Right. So rather than getting stuck in a local minima, play is all about pushing your own edge. Playing in something you already know very, very well isn't very fun, actually. Play is always about a little bit finding the edge, creating good volatilities at the edge. And then when you encounter those volatilities require you to self-organize in new ways as you learn about that edge, right? So it's like sometimes it's called a bad bootstrap, which is the system gets stuck in a way of self-organizing. So one of the shared characteristics, this might be relevant here, one of the shared characteristics that we've become interested in with pathology. So when you look at a lot of pathologies through this framework, like I said, like depression and addiction and OCD and anxiety and depersonalization, dissociation disorders, they share a feature, which is kind of interesting. They all have this feature of one kind of little bit bad belief network getting stuck and then insulating itself from being updated and then driving self-organization without allowing itself to be updated. So think about depression. Depression is you get a belief network installed high up in the predictive hierarchy that says no matter what you do, you will not be able to reduce the volatility of your environment. This environment is undigestably volatile. That belief is now installed. Now a nasty thing happens. So in predictive processing, you see this everywhere. Everything is a sort of feedback loop. Everything is in a way a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the thing you expect is the thing you go to look out to find. And in a noisy environment like ours, you can almost confirm any kind of prediction. This is the problem with echo chambers online right now. You can believe any stupid old thing and find somebody else who believes it. And that helps confirm your belief, right? Okay. Now think about the nastiness of getting a belief like you can't succeed at reducing error sufficiently high up in the hierarchy. The nasty thing that happens, and we think that this is what typifies major depression, is the system then starts trying to confirm that belief. It starts trying to confirm that prediction in the environment. So what that looks like is you get the volume turned up on feedback that tells you, yep, that belief is right. I'm a loser. I cannot get a good grip. The world is too challenging. And it turns the volume down on any data that might go against that prediction, because we are trying to confirm our predictions.
Does that reduce error? If you if you have beliefs and you change, like if you try and see the world in a way that confirms that you are a loser, say, and is that actually in a way reducing error? Like,
Yeah,
is that why
that's
they should think
exactly,
about it?
that's the nasty part. Is now this is why so back to the very first point about how optimal systems can become suboptimal. You get a belief, you get a bad belief network installed, like you can't manage. Okay. And then something really weird happens. You start being rewarded by failing in a way. You have
Mm.
low and middle level volatility. It doesn't feel good, but you are satisfying this deep prediction. So in a way, you are now self-organizing relative to this bad belief network. So the system is still working optimally. Notice that it's optimally tracking the world in ways that make the world and the belief structure fit. But when you get a stuck belief, like the world doesn't work and it refuses to be updated, then it can adjust the whole self-organizing system. So now what it means to reduce prediction error is to create a world that fits with your bad belief that the world doesn't work. And anybody here who's had depression, or anybody who's listening to this who's had depression, I think you can even get a sense for that we end up making the world that we expect. We go out and we actually produce the situations, or we highlight the situations that confirm the thing that we feel. And we have some experimentation for this too. There's a really nice study that was done where they took people who were, really major depression, okay, and they gave them a beeper, and they asked them, like, how often are you depressed? And these people would say, well, I'm always depressed. And say, okay, well, how much of the time? 100% of the time. Like, I wake up
Mm.
feeling bad, and I live feeling bad, and then I go to sleep feeling bad, and I have bad dreams, then I wake up feeling bad. I'm always depressed. Okay, that's their phenomenology. They gave them a beeper.
Laptop 0HHRNT3B.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, that's okay. They gave them a beeper, and then they beeped them occasionally and got them to write in their journal, like, how are you actually feeling at that moment? And it turns out that there's only sort of like 10 or 15% of the time where they sort of in negative affective states. The rest of the time, they were either in neutral or in positive affective states.
Mm.
So they actually weren't depressed all the time. So what was happening there? In part, they were turning the volume up on the evidence that confirmed their belief that they were depressed. And they're turning the volume way down on all of the counter evidence. It's one of the ways that the kind of system we are makes a good grip, is sometimes it ignores relevant information in favor of confirming its own prediction, which is nasty, right? How do you get out of that? How do you get out of this stuck belief network now that's saying you can't do it? That's one of the things that play can do, I think, because you start playing at your edge again. You start finding new volatility slopes. You start upsetting some of your old stuck beliefs. That can be one way forward to get these beliefs to start moving again. So we know that already. Things like acceptance and commitment therapy really works for depression. Do you know this? Do you know acceptance and commitment therapy? Have you heard this?
I think I might be somewhat familiar with. I've done a bit of talking with clinical psychologists, but you might want to go into it.
Yeah, so it's really easy. I mean, basically what your good therapist says to you is, I want you to accept that you feel like crap and that you don't feel like it's ever going to work. And I want you to commit to doing 5 things a day anyway. And they give you a list and you just shut up and do them. It's just like, doesn't matter how bad you feel. It doesn't matter that you predict that this won't work. I want you to wake up and make your bed, brush your teeth, read a chapter of a book, call a friend, and I want you to go to sleep by 10. I want you to do those things. And then I want you to check them off. And I want you to really look that you did that. Basically, what you're doing is you're reteaching the system that thinks, I can't act in a way that gets me a good predictive grip, that has any kind of effect on the world. And you give them counter evidence. You're basically creating counter evidence that can upset this set belief. Yeah.
I see. Interesting. We're probably going out of time, like, because I have more questions, but one thing that makes you want to touch on is, because I think it's relevant here, is meditation, and the way you talk about how that is specifically also something which, it's like, again, in that counterpoint to addiction, can sort of reset the way we think about the things like affect in our lives. So do you think meditation is relevant here? And if so, how?
Yeah, good. So yeah, it's a really good question. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah.
We should pick another pod and
Let's
zoom
do it.
in on something if you think it's interesting and we can really get
Sure.
into it. Yeah, meditation is really relevant here. This is another major branch of my research right now. Working with a great team at Monash University in their new Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. Yeah, meditation has all sorts of really interesting impacts on this kind of system. For one, this is a little bit technical again, so slow me down if it goes a bit deep, okay? Let's see if we can get it out straight in a useful way. One of the things that you can do with meditation is you can begin to access the shape of your own generative model in a useful, tangible, and potentially control increasing, agency increasing way. So one of the challenges with various sorts of pathologies is that the system that's keeping you stuck is in a way transparent to the system. Meaning, for instance, with depression, let's use addiction again. Let's use like addiction to cigarettes. This is maybe a nice one, okay? So what happens what drives the smoking behavior? So you've generated now an expectation for a certain level of nicotine in the system. As that begins to drop, errors begin to rise, okay? And those errors produce a sort of negative affective tension in the system. That negative affective tension is it's driving the predictive system to start selecting behaviors that will get it back to where it expects to be. In this case, it's the drug seeking and taking behavior. It's the reaching for the cigarettes and pulling them out and smoking, okay? So how do you interrupt that? Well, mindfulness has been shown to have a really great impact on, for instance, overcoming cigarette addiction. And why is that the case? Well, the advice is that when you feel like you want to have a cigarette, become really mindful of the feeling of wanting a cigarette itself. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Before you really look at that feeling just drives the behaviors in a way we might say that's transparent. We're not necessarily aware of the craving. Rather, the craving just drives the selection of behaviors that brings you back into status quo. You might not be aware that you actually have a craving. Rather, the craving just drives the system. So what you want to do with mindfulness in order to gain more control in that kind of a situation is you want to become more aware of the craving itself rather than letting the craving drive the behavior. So in a way, what you're doing is you're taking a craving which is ordinarily experienced as transparent and you're making it opaque. You're making it an object of scrutiny by looking in and saying, what is that craving like? Okay, one reason that helps is because that interrupts the natural flow from craving to drug seeking and taking. So that's already a little bit useful. That's not really the most powerful thing that's happening when you're mindful of craving. Do you know what, can you intuit what's the more impactful thing that's happening? What happens when you become mindful of craving that prevents that from leading to drug taking and seeking and taking? Do you know? Can you intuit?
Okay, if I think about the predictive processing framework, well, like you're not actually going down that prediction error pathway, but then in a sense, I mean, one thing I'm thinking is that you're opening up other opportunities in the environment, but also maybe as well, like you're putting less emphasis on that part of the model. I mean, no, yeah,
that's good. No, that's good. That's good. That's real close. Exactly right. Okay, one of the things that you're gaining there is you're gaining a better model of the craving that ordinarily drives the behavior. Okay. And this is the little bit complex part. Something really interesting happens when the model begins to model itself.
Yeah. Like when you make that meta model. Okay.
Right. Meta models. Exactly. So now you are making your own craving an object of scrutiny. So now you're making predictions over that craving. Now those cravings are driving precision. So we haven't talked about that much, but what I mean to say is the craving itself is tuning the volume on the behaviors that lead to drug taking and seeking and taking. Okay. So you can imagine the craving itself is like turning a volume up on those predictions. Okay. So ordinarily, as the volume goes up on those predictions, they become potent, and then they drive the system in order to resolve the error, in order to get you back into the state you want to be in. Something really special happens when the system begins to make predictions about how precision is being deployed over predictions. You're now making predictions about how precision is being deployed over predictions about drug seeking and taking. That can only happen if you look at the precision deployment, which is look at the craving. You then start producing predictions about those precisions. And as soon as you have predictions about precisions, then you again have optimization at a higher level. Now the system is starting to have the power to decide, should I follow this information or not? Okay. The way that feels phenomenologically, if you've ever done this, is you become mindful of craving. And what happens if you really look closely at craving? It shows itself to be not such a big deal in a way. It turns out that all craving is a bunch of feelings in the body. It's like a bit of tummy tension and a bit of like arm and shoulder tension. And actually tension is just, I mean, even that's not really pain. It's just tension or vibration or pressure. As soon as you realize that all of that information is just that, then there is not such a strong need in order to follow it. It's not like it's actually even a craving anymore. It's just a bundle of sensations. So that's what we think is happening when we have this meta modeling of these precision dynamics, is you are, rather than letting them drive the system directly, which is the sort of craving leading to drug seeking and taking, we are making those into an object of scrutiny, which changes our relationship to them. In the parlance of some papers that we've written, we say that emotional information, that craving information, becomes information in the system rather than being identical to the system. If that's not clear, let me give you one more quick example. I don't mean to hog all the airtime here.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
One more quick example. I think jealousy is a good one. That's my favorite go-to here. If you experience the world transparently through your jealousy, then you see a world where your partner is inherently untrustworthy, and the people around them are also a little bit crooked and like looking for ways into your relationship. That's how you actually experience the world. So you have jealousy as a system that's tuning the predictive model to appreciate the world in a certain way, and that way is in a jealous-like way. So then what does that person end up saying? That person ends up saying things like, you're at fault. You shouldn't dress or act like that. This person is whatever. Okay. Notice they're not saying anything about their own predictive system. The predictive system is now driving out to try to solve the error by fixing the world. Okay.
But it kind of confirms the predictions as well in a way.
Oh, yeah. Of course. Right. Of course. And it's always noisy. It's always noisy, right? So if you are jealous, then you are going to find data in the world to confirm your jealous beliefs. Fact. Totally fact. It's noisy enough that you're going to be able to like extract that if you really want it. If that becomes really strong, you're going to be able to extract it from the environment for sure. Okay, now what happens if you become mindful of your jealousy? So now what you're doing is you're making a part of your own model an object of scrutiny. So you start realizing, oh, wow, look, there's jealousy turned on, and this is how jealousy works. And look, that's the kinds of things jealousy wants to say. The difference then, once you become mindful of jealousy, is rather than transparently seeing the world through your jealousy, you know that jealousy is a kind of information in the system. It's not identical to the system. It's information in the system. So the difference there would be, you will then be the kind of person who then approaches your partner and says, look, the body is feeling jealous, or I'm having a jealous experience. Can I check in with you to see whether this information is accurate, useful, stupid, not useful? Like, I need to check in. You do that with your therapist or with your partner or with your good friends. That's why it's good to have meditating friends, because that's the kind of skillfulness they bring to a relationship. Is they say, I'm having a certain prediction come online, and my predictions are not always 100% accurate. I want to double check to see whether or not the information is tracking reality. And if it is, then let's fix that. And if it's not, then I need to update my model. That becomes really available once the system is able to meta model lots of its own processing dynamics. And that's the research line we're taking. We don't have so much time to get really into the nitty gritty today, but that's really what we're interested in, is how meta modeling your own processes opens up this new vista of control, self-understanding, insight, and all of that is at the base of really learning how to optimize in your life. You can check out the work at our lab if you're interested in this, though. There's tons there.
Thank you. Well, you said you have to go in 2 minutes, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so thanks for that. I have some follow-up questions, but we can do this again. And I'll go into depth in some more topics. So, where can people find you? And you want to have a last word or anything else you
Yeah,
want to?
good. Yeah, loads of places. I'm a co-host of a great podcast we'd love you to check out as well, called the Contemplative Science Podcast. We talk about this a lot. Most of our episodes have a little bit of predictive processing in them, just because that's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But we talk to great people on the podcast all the time, so that's cool. I've got a website, which is markdmiller.live, where I keep up to date the projects I'm working on, papers and talks and podcasts that I'm doing. And you can find me at the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies at the University of Monash, which, again, if you're interested in this stuff, you want to check it out. That center is devoted to taking really cutting edge research and converting it into practical courses that are applicable and useful for people to actually live better lives. That's the whole center's modus operandi, is to take lab stuff and convert it to useful course stuff. So if you're interested in like science-based meditation programs, you're definitely going to want to check out M3CS, which is the name of the lab. And over the next year, they're going to be producing a ton of really high quality courses based on exactly this kind of research.
Awesome. That's the stuff I actually want to learn about more. So maybe we could talk about that again.
I
Okay.
love that. Let's zoom right in next time, and we could talk about enlightenment. We could talk about Buddhism. I mean, it'd be awesome.
Okay. Awesome.
Cool. Right on.
Recording. Well, you literally have to go. So awesome. But yeah, thanks for coming. Again, also I wanted to like double click on as well. I do think that the trying to bridge behavioral economics to predictive processing, I think would be honestly kind of an awesome challenge.
It's huge,
so
man. And look up at Carl Friston's work on economics. And I'm working with Maxwell Ramstead on some things that are pretty close to this. Like we're looking at sustainability in big systems using active inference, which is pretty close to economics. I will forward to you any stuff that's even in the neighborhood if I bump into.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for giving me those names. Okay, awesome.
Where are you going to post this? Will this be on your YouTube channel?
I'll be put it on YouTube. I'll also try and make a Spotify podcast, but for now, it'll be YouTube. I'll give you the link when I put
Love that. Great. And how did it go? You think everything went well? Was that good?
Yeah, I think it was really good. I really enjoyed it. I learned loads. I think people enjoy it. So
awesome, man. Okay, thanks for the invitation, and let me know if you want me to come back.
Yeah. All right. Awesome.
Okay, brother. Cool. Have a good day.
Right. You too. See you.
Bye-bye.